I was 28 when this happened, about 2 years ago, just days before Christmas. I'd taken the entire week off from going into the office. My job allowed remote work as long as deadlines were met, and I'd saved up enough remote days to stay home all week. With a major winter storm forecasted and the holidays approaching, I figured it was the perfect excuse to stay inside, work quietly, and enjoy a slower pace. I've always preferred late nights over early mornings, so I didn't start working until around noon that day. The first few hours were uneventful. I sat at my desk with a mug of coffee, answering emails and slowly chipping away at my tasks. As the afternoon went on, the weather worsened. The wind began slamming against the side of the house, and thick snow fell steadily outside my window. By around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, the sky had darkened so much it felt like evening already. The clouds were heavy, and snow had completely covered the neighborhood. I had planned to go out and grab dinner, but one look at the roads outside convinced me otherwise. I stayed in. As night fully set in, the storm intensified. I kept the blinds open so I could watch the snow swirl under the streetlights while I worked. That's when I noticed something strange. A faint beam of light flickered outside my window. At first, I thought it was a reflection. Then the light moved, slowly, deliberately. There was no mistaking it. Someone outside was using a flashlight. I leaned back in my chair and watched for several seconds, trying to make sense of it. Who would be wandering around in this kind of weather? Curiosity got the better of me, and I stood up, stepping closer to the window to get a better look. Before I could identify where the light was coming from, it vanished. It might have been turned off or blocked by something, but between the darkness and heavy snowfall, I couldn't see anything else. I convinced myself it was probably a neighbor searching for a lost pet or checking something outside. It didn't seem threatening at the time. I went back to work. Over the next couple of hours, the house groaned and creaked under the pressure of the wind. Every so often, I heard a noise that sounded slightly too sharp or too heavy to be normal. Each time, I paused, listening, but the sounds never repeated. I kept telling myself it was just the storm. Then I heard a loud thud. This wasn't a creak or a groan. It sounded like something breaking, something solid. Worse, it sounded like it came from inside the house. I stood up immediately and stepped into the hallway. Everything was quiet. I slowly moved downstairs, scanning the rooms as best I could. Nothing looked disturbed, and aside from the wind outside, there were no sounds. I didn't feel scared enough to search every corner of the house. Without any further noise, it felt irrational to panic. I started heading back upstairs. I was nearly at the top when I heard a sharp click. The power went out. The house was swallowed by darkness so complete I couldn't see my own hands. With the storm outside, not even moonlight filtered in. I froze, heart pounding. I assumed the weather had knocked out the power or tripped the breaker. Slowly, I felt my way back down the stairs, moving carefully so I wouldn't fall. The breaker box was in the basement, at the far end of the lower hallway. I followed the wall with my hand, taking small steps. That's when I heard it. Movement. It was subtle at first, muffled, but it was coming from behind the basement door. The sound grew closer, and then I heard the slow creak of the door opening. My stomach dropped. I stepped backward and quietly slipped into the bathroom beside me, leaving the door open. Closing it felt too risky. I stood perfectly still, barely breathing. Footsteps echoed softly down the hallway. They came closer and closer, until they passed directly in front of the bathroom doorway. I never saw the person, only darkness, but I knew they were no more than a few feet away. The footsteps continued toward the stairs. Once they reached the carpeted steps, the sound disappeared completely. The storm outside suddenly felt deafening. I waited, unsure if the person had stopped or gone upstairs. Taking the risk, I moved. I crept out of the bathroom, crossed the house by touch alone, grabbed my keys from the garage, and ran outside into the snow. I got into my car and drove away, using the SOS feature to contact the police. When they arrived, the intruder was gone. The police determined that whoever broke in had disabled the power intentionally. They went straight upstairs, to my office, then my bedroom, and nowhere else. They were looking for me. What haunts me the most is how easily they moved through my house in complete darkness. They knew exactly where I'd be. It could have been someone I knew, someone I spoke to regularly, someone who knew my routine. I moved shortly after that. Since then, nothing has happened, and I hope it stays that way. I was driving alone before sunrise, trying to make it from Minneapolis to my sister's place in Montana before the weekend. It was meant to be a simple winter trip, just me, my aging but reliable Subaru, and far too much gas station coffee to stay awake. For the first several hours, everything went smoothly. The roads were clear, traffic was light, and the sky was calm. But once I pushed farther north, the landscape changed. Towns grew farther apart, cell service faded in and out, and snow began drifting down in slow, harmless flakes. That calm didn't last. As daylight disappeared, the snowfall thickened. Within minutes, it went from a gentle dusting to a blinding white curtain. My headlights struggled to punch through it, and the road vanished beneath layers of snow. I couldn't tell where the lanes ended or where the shoulder began. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. After nearly an hour of fighting the storm, I decided I'd stop at the next sign of civilization, anything with lights, just to wait it out. Not long after making that decision, I noticed a faint glow off to the side of the road. I barely caught it in time to slow down and turn in. The place turned out to be a small roadside cafe. The parking lot was tiny and nearly swallowed by snow. 3 cars were already there. One looked like it had been sitting for hours, half buried, while the other 2 appeared recently parked. I pulled in, shut off the engine, and stepped out into the freezing wind. By the time I reached the door, my face was numb. Inside, the cafe felt frozen in time. It was old, dimly lit, and quiet, too quiet. A woman stood behind the counter, and 2 men sat at the bar with mugs of coffee. No one was talking. When I walked in, all 3 of them turned toward me at the same time, greeting me almost in unison. It felt off. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I ordered coffee and sat near the front window, watching the storm slowly bury the cars outside. As I sat there, I couldn't help but keep glancing back at one of the men at the bar. He was older, maybe in his 50s, pale and motionless. The best way I can describe him is that he looked like he hadn't slept in years, or like he didn't quite belong among the living. When I moved away from the bar, the cafe fell silent again. After several uncomfortable minutes, one of the men stood up and said he was going to try to reach his cabin before the roads closed completely. He walked out into the storm. Not long after, the other man got up and left as well, without a word. Something about that bothered me. I asked the woman behind the counter if she knew them. She said they'd arrived around the same time and seemed to be arguing outside before coming in. After that, they barely spoke. I stayed inside for another half hour, making small talk with her while keeping an eye on the snow. When I finally looked back outside, my stomach dropped. Both cars were still there, but the men were gone. I stepped outside to check, and the cold hit me like a wall. The storm had eased slightly, but visibility was still terrible. There were no voices, no movement, just wind and falling snow. A deep sense of dread settled in. I decided to leave. When I reached my car and turned the key, nothing happened. No clicking, no struggling. Completely dead. My car had been fine the entire trip, and it hadn't been sitting long enough for cold alone to do that. That's when I noticed movement. Behind the cafe, at the edge of the woods, a dark figure emerged. One of the men. He walked slowly toward the parking lot, partially swallowed by snow and shadow. I didn't wait. I ran back inside and locked the door. I told the woman to call the police immediately. She hesitated, but did it anyway. Moments later, the man appeared at the door. He tried to open it, then looked directly at me through the glass. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale and hollow, exactly as lifeless as I'd thought earlier. He banged on the door once, hard, then suddenly turned and sprinted back to his car. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. Only 3 cars remained. Mine, the woman's, and the buried one. Officers followed faint tracks behind the cafe and into the woods. That's where they found the other man's body. Nothing had been taken. No robbery. Just violence. Both his car and mine had the same damage. The ignition lines had been deliberately cut. The conclusion was obvious. The man had sabotaged both vehicles, waited for an opportunity, and attacked when one of them stepped back outside. If I hadn't locked that door, I likely would have been next. I eventually made it safely to my sister's place. The man was never found. And to this day, the image of him emerging from the snowy woods, walking calmly back toward the cars, still sends a chill through me. I don't take winter road trips anymore. It happened during winter break, right in that quiet stretch between Christmas and New Year's. I was back in my hometown, staying with family while college was on pause, but life didn't pause with it. Bills were still waiting, so whenever I had free time, I'd log into a delivery app and take orders. That night, snow was falling steadily, not enough to shut things down, but enough to keep people indoors. Those nights usually paid well. Orders came in back-to-back, and everything felt routine until late evening, around 10, when requests slowed but didn't stop completely. Then I accepted one that stood out. The drop-off was farther than normal, nearly 20 minutes away. My town is small, but the houses are scattered, especially near the wooded outskirts. Still, nothing about it seemed dangerous at first. The GPS led me off the main road and onto a narrow stretch surrounded by trees. Eventually, it stopped at what looked like the entrance to a driveway, barely visible under untouched snow. No tire tracks, no lights, no sign anyone had been there recently. Just a dark path disappearing into the forest. I stayed in my car and called the customer, assuming the address had to be wrong. He picked up immediately. His voice was low and rough, the kind that sounded permanently damaged by cigarettes. I explained where I was and told him I couldn't see a house or a clear driveway. He replied like I was missing something obvious, saying the snow probably covered it. When I told him I wasn't comfortable driving through unplowed woods, his tone shifted, annoyed, almost mocking. He said that was the whole reason he ordered delivery in the first place. I didn't like the way he spoke to me, but I didn't want a bad rating or a canceled order after driving all that way. So I gave in. I locked my car, grabbed the food, and stepped into the snow. The path wasn't deep enough to stop me, but it was uneven and hard to read. Without lights, I couldn't tell where the driveway ended and the forest began. I just followed what looked like a slightly clearer stretch between the trees. With every step, my car faded farther behind me. It was the only reference point I had, the last bit of safety glowing faintly in the dark. Ahead of me, everything looked the same: trees, snow, and darkness stretching endlessly forward. Then I heard it, a crunch to my left. It sounded like a footstep. Not close, but not far either. I froze and shined my phone light toward the noise, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. After a few seconds, I convinced myself it was just an animal and kept going. But the longer I walked, the worse the feeling got. By now, I should have seen something, any sign of a house. Instead, the forest stayed silent and empty. I stopped, suddenly aware of how wrong everything felt. That's when the thought finally hit me. What if there was no house at all? The idea settled heavy in my chest. Standing alone in the freezing woods, I realized how easy it would be for someone to lure a stranger out here. I pulled out my phone and decided to call the customer again. If he didn't answer, or tried pushing me further, I was done. The phone rang. Twice. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a faint glow deep between the trees. A light, brief, distant. Before I could focus on it, it vanished. At the same moment, the call disconnected. That was enough. I turned and ran. Snow crunched loudly under my feet, drowning out everything else. I couldn't tell if someone was behind me or not, and that uncertainty made it worse. I didn't stop until I reached my car. That's when I saw it. One side of the car was sagging. A tire lay flat against the snow, sliced clean through. Someone had done that while I was gone. I didn't think. I just got in and drove, even with the damaged tire, desperate to put distance between myself and the woods. I called the police while I was leaving, but nothing really came of it. A few questions. No urgency, but I know what that was. Someone wanted me out there, and they didn't want me leaving easily. I still don't know what would have happened if I kept walking, but I'm certain I was never supposed to find a house. And that thought still follows me every winter night.